Hi, it's Ray. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome to, at last, my February wrap-up video. I know that this is coming a bit late, but hopefully I'm still getting it in under the wire of it being March and not April. March so far has just been such a crazy busy month for me that I have not had the time to read, let alone to make videos about what I've been reading. But I am now, thank goodness, on spring break, and as you can see, I'm not in front of my bookshelves. We have gone away, which I know is such an enormous privilege in this COVID world. We're at this resort and there's literally nobody here apart from us, which is probably partly because of COVID and partly because it seems like we didn't do our research and we turned up during rainy season. But I am actually super happy about that. All I want is a couple of weeks to read my books and make some more YouTube videos, so this is kind of perfect. I hope the rain in the background is a pleasant level of noise rather than being annoying. I adore the sound of rain like this. It just makes me so happy. I hope it does for you too, and I hope that you enjoy hearing about the books that I read last month. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about that I read last month is the Hetty Feather kind of trilogy by Jaqueline Wilson. These are obviously children's books, and I read them initially for the Jaqueline Wilsathon that Connie Reads and a group of other YouTubers, who I'll link down below, were hosting, and this just reminded me that I had Hetty Feather in my Audible library, had never listened to it, and so I thought now was the perfect time to do that. These books I will talk about vaguely as an overview of the three of them, but then I will talk about them separately because I actually feel like each individual book was quite a different journey, and I had quite a different response to each of those books, so I would like to review them individually. But overall, they are a trilogy about a girl, Hetty Feather, who grows up in the Foundling Hospital in London during Victorian times, and it's a kind of Bildungsroman-esque series in that it starts off with her as a child and it goes through to her middling teenage years by the time you get to the third book. There's actually sort of 5 books in this series, which I didn't really realise when I set out. In fact, when I first set out, I thought it was a standalone novel, but it is a series of about 5 books, and a disclaimer that's worth being aware of that I didn't realise when I started, which might have even changed my decision to start them, is that the 4th book in the kind of series is from the perspective of a different character, and that character is a new character who you don't meet until later on in the first of the 3 books. And the 5th book I haven't even got around to reading yet, but that goes back to being narrated by Hetty. The first 3 books are narrated by Hetty Feather herself, and she has a really idiosyncratic voice, perhaps quite Jaqueline Wilson-esque. I haven't read enough Wilson recently to really be able to compare, but she seems very chatty, she seems very confident. She's a fun narrator. Okay, let's start with book 1. So the first book, Hetty Feather, absolutely blew me away. I loved this book and I would recommend it to everybody, children and adults alike. I felt like it was just a perfect example of historical children's fiction in that it included a lot of relevant information from the Victorian era. It definitely made me really intrigued to go to the Foundling Hospital. I learnt stuff from it. It didn't skim over or ignore a lot of the hardships and atrocities and abuse that went on in the Victorian era and the suffering that the children experienced, but at the same time it was upbeat, it was lively, it was fun, it was enjoyable. It walked really well the line between the banal and the ridiculous, in terms of there were times when you knew that the story wouldn't really ever go like that, but it didn't go too far, and you didn't think this is just completely unbelievable rubbish. Like, you could suspend your disbelief very comfortably for the duration of the novel. It begins with Hetty writing later on in life and kind of flashing back to the beginning of her life, and it then goes chronologically through from her birth, but told through Hetty's own memory. So, she claims that she can remember these things, but of course you know that she can't really. It's kind of a mixture of her imagination and reality. And then it goes through her experience first as being like an adopted foster child of a family in the countryside, which is apparently, according to the story, what used to happen. So children who were often not unwanted, but who the parents were incapable of caring for, would be dropped off at the doorstep of the Foundling Hospital. They would then be sent away to be cared for by a foster family up until the age of 5. When they returned to the institution, it was very much an institution, kind of similar to the workhouse vibe, but not so bad. And they would spend their years from 5 to approximately 14. Inside this institution, they would basically never leave. And there they received all of their education, all of their meals, sleeping in a large dormitory, and the experience was evidently extremely traumatic, Hetty is really aware of this. She's aware of the injustice. She calls out the injustice and the unfairness throughout the novel, which is really satisfying. Overall, I was listening to this on audiobook. I couldn't stop listening to it. I wanted to listen to it in every spare moment of time that I had because the story was really gripping, really well paced, and it was a great novel. Very much enjoyed, and I immediately went out after this to get the second one, Sapphire, Battersea it's called, which follows Hetty's years at the very end of her time at the Foundling Hospital out into the world. So children in the Foundling Hospital were trained up to be servants, and this book follows her as she becomes a servant. And again, I loved this book. Again, I found the plot really well paced, particularly enjoyed the first half of this book, which was a bit more settled than the second half. And again, just found it a wonderful example of historical fiction, the details of what life was like as a servant, the fact that even though it was hard and challenging, it was still actually a step up in terms of lifestyle for Hetty from being in the Foundling Hospital. That was really nice to see, the way that it was portrayed. And Wilson in both novels just has a real mix and range of characters who come in and out of life in a believable way. So even though you kind of craved and wanted to go back to some of the characters from the earlier novels, you knew that they were really gone from Hetty's life. Just the way that people in your own life who you were friends with in childhood and they moved away can be gone and never regained. Obviously that was especially the case in the Victorian period when there was less communication, less ability to communicate or to Google somebody and find out where they are and what they're up to. There are references in this book to things like seances, to that kind of interplay between a religious society and a fascination with the dead and the afterlife and spirits. That was really interesting. In all three novels, the role of the circus in Victorian society and the way that circus people were seen plays a very big part. And overall, again, this novel was wonderful. The ending completely gripped me. I felt all the emotions all the way through this novel, and I just thought, wonderful, hurrah, I found a new favourite series. I'm so happy about this. Great. Then I got Emerald Star, and to be perfectly honest, I think I gave it 3 stars, maybe 2.5. It was one of those books which was okay. Like, I don't regret reading it, although I do feel kind of let down by it because it didn't do for me what I wanted the series to do, and I felt like a lot of the points that were really strong in the first novel kind of weakened in the third. And I just feel like this should have been a trilogy of books, not 5 books. The ending was one of those endings that felt like it was deliberately manipulated in order to enable the series to go on so that the author could get more money from writing more books, rather than because it was really the right ending for the story. That's how I felt. Reading a lot of Goodreads reviews from children for whom these books are actually written, I think they enjoy the way that the series goes a lot more than I did as an adult. I appreciated very much some of the stuff that Jaqueline Wilson does with the story. There's some directions that you expect it to take, but you're a bit like, oh, that's such a cliche, and I'm not really very comfortable with it going in that direction. And then she doesn't put it in that direction, and I loved that. Thought that was fantastic. The actual ending of the third novel for me was quite bizarre and kind of a massive letdown. One of the main issues that I had with it, alongside the ending, is that this book just felt really busy in a kind of overly stimulating way. And I think that's just a personal preference that I have in books, is that I start to feel exhausted when characters go on really long journeys that don't ever seem to come to an end, and they just face trial after trial and they never get settled. I think it's because I'm a person who really loves home and really loves the feeling of being settled, and I very much enjoy that in my novels too. But compared to the first two, it just felt too much. The story stopped walking that fine line between the believable and the ridiculous, and just tilted too far over towards the ridiculous. And it was also not until this novel that I found out the thing that I said before about how the fourth novel in the series is told from the perspective of somebody new, which I kind of understand because I think the story was progressing with Hetty perhaps too far towards adulthood, and number 4 kind of brings it back down to the voice of a younger child. Obviously Jaqueline Wilson is a children's author, so I respect that decision, but in terms of my own enjoyment of them, reading them as an adult, the third novel was really a flop. I would say I still enjoyed it, as in it was still an audiobook that I was seeking out. It wasn't something that was boring me, it just annoyed me a bit. So those were the 3 books in the Hetty Feather trilogy. I Okay, moving on. The next thing that I read, and this was pretty much my only 100% definitely adult book that I read, also my only non-fiction, and that was Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. I'm aware that I am reading this kind of a bit behind the curve. This book has been on my to-read list for a while. Obviously, last year, pretty much everybody read it, and I didn't get around to it then, but I finally got around to it last month. Unsurprisingly, I found it to be a really excellent book. This book addresses white privilege and institutional racism in the UK, which I think is particularly interesting as somebody from the UK when a lot of writing on this topic is regarding race relations in the US, and can kind of lead to this belief that racism is a problem in the US more so than in the UK, which is just not true. So it was great to just be more educated on the topic, to find out more about it, about history. This book was full of a lot of really hard-hitting statistics, just like the fact that slavery in the UK has not existed for a far shorter amount of time than it did previously exist. I think we very much have this perspective in the UK that slavery has nothing to do with us, and if it was anything to do with us, then William Wilberforce, we got rid of slavery. So it was great and just so important to read contradictory opinions to that, which I honestly think that's what I was taught in schools in the UK. If slavery was touched upon at all, which it barely was, the lack of teaching about our cultural history of racism is simply appalling. As I mentioned, it was a book that pretty much everybody read last year, and I think it's very much become a core reader, which is great, and it was a really worthwhile read. There were some topics for me where Reni Eddo-Lodge just did a wonderful job of elucidating them and putting her perspective forwards so clearly and simply and understandably, and therefore so powerfully, particularly the chapter on feminism and intersectionality, and also on racism and class. I do think that reading this book now, as opposed to 3 years ago, was not such a hard-hitting and informative experience as it would have been, and that is a massive positive. That is just because pretty much through scrolling through social media and having conversations with people, I was already aware of a lot of the arguments in the book and of a reasonable amount of the history too. So I'd really recommend this book as a place to start. I think it's wonderfully well written, really powerful, but I also think that now, thankfully, conversation has moved forwards, and I felt like this book was a good kind of springboard for me to want to look into and read more, particularly about history, but also about people of colour's experience living in the UK right now, through both fiction and non-fiction perspectives. Okay, I've left the worst 3 till last. So these were 3 novels that I listened to on audiobook while I was working from home. We were teaching from home for most of February. We went back to school in person in kind of late February, and then March has all been back in person. And while I was doing online school, I had a reasonable amount of time where the work that I was doing was such that I could listen to an audiobook in the background, and I decided to kind of churn through a number of historical children's novels, so not historical fiction, i.e. children's novels that were written like 100, 200 years ago, that are classics that I have not read, that I just kind of wanted to have experienced and be aware of the story, the writing style, etc., because I feel like they're regularly referenced, particularly in Victorian adult fiction, as being the novels which influence children. I read 3 of these. They were all, in their own ways, bizarre and kind of bad, and I think a lot of that is really just down to how quickly fiction ages and how quickly perspectives have become utterly inappropriate and how quickly our moral system has changed in the last couple of 100 years. So they were really fascinating reads from more of a research perspective, but less so enjoyable reads in and of themselves. The first one of these that I read was The Swiss Family Robinson. As you can guess from the title, this is about a family who are shipwrecked and have to carve out a life for themselves. So quite similar to Robinson Crusoe, which I also really didn't like. This book was an easier read than Robinson Crusoe. Obviously it's written for children. I hadn't really twigged, I don't know why, this was a stupid thing not to twig, but the family in it are Swiss, so it's in translation. It was originally written in Swiss German. However, the language in the translation that I listened to was still really archaic. It was written around the same time as The Children of the New Forest, I think, and the language felt very similar to that. Each chapter was really just an exploration of another small challenge in their life that they faced and overcame in terms of caring for themselves in the jungle and setting up a sustainable life for themselves. I say sustainable in inverted commas because the life that they set up for themselves is the least sustainable thing you could ever think of. They basically just went in to this forest and colonized it about as brutally as they could. They killed everything with guns throughout the whole story. If there was an animal and it was in their way, they shot it. Did they need to shoot it? No, but they did it for fun. Killing was very much a sport for them. It was even encouraged by the father as a sport, and there's this real disconnect between the fact that the father, who is the narrator of the story, keeps going on about all these excellent moral values that he's teaching his children, and the values that they actually appear to be living by, which are misogynistic, racist, and violent, and not really much else. I ended up finding it really funny. It turned into one of those books that for me was so bad it's good, particularly because the person who narrated it had this really snobbish, well-to-do voice that just completely cracked me up, because it really kind of played on this father's completely self-absorbed, self-congratulatory attitude to life. Definitely get the sense that he is extremely happy being king of all he surveys and having nobody around to tell him that he's not very good at something or that he's not very nice, both of which things are definitely true. And he spends most of the book bragging and boasting to his boys about how wonderful he is. It was an experience. I think as an adult, maybe it's worth a read. I mean, I wouldn't push it too far up your TBR list, but if you're interested in reading it as a historical document, definitely worth it. But I actively wouldn't really want a child to read it, because I think it would be very easy with that kind of impressionable nature that you have as a child. I know when I was a child, I definitely believed everything that I read. Maybe some children are better than I was in that sense, but I think it would be almost a kind of dangerous read for a child, because it's so overtly moralistic, but the moral values which it encourages are not ones that most people would want their children to live by today. So read to children with caution. Perhaps you could read it with a child of kind of 10 years old, maybe even younger, if you were prepared to read it from a discussion perspective and to challenge it openly with them, but it wouldn't be a book that I would want to just leave a child with to enjoy. It does come up a lot in Victorian literature, so the reason why I first started reading it is that I'm also reading Childhood, Boyhood, Youth by Leo Tolstoy, and he referenced Swiss Family Robinson as a game that they were playing, and that's something I've definitely experienced in other Victorian children's books that I've read. This reference to the Swiss Family Robinson, how they love to play Swiss Family Robinson. Thankfully, there are no people actually living in the land that the Swiss Family Robinson invade, basically, so it doesn't turn into open warfare, but it would have done if there were people there. So that was Swiss Family Robinson. What a ride. Then, another wild ride was White Fang. Hey, I just had a lunch break and it stopped raining. It might be a little bit noisier in the background now because the rain was kind of drowning out some general background noise, sounds, music and talking and that sort of thing, but we'll roll with it. So, White Fang. How incredibly far removed from the environment that I am currently in. White Fang was written in 1906 by Jaqueline. It's set in rural North America. I'm not sure whether it's Canada or Alaska, but that kind of region. And it was completely unlike anything I have ever read before, with the exception of Call of the Wild, which is also by Jack London and is kind of the thematic mirror of White Fang. So in White Fang is the story of a wild wolf's journey towards domestication, and Call of the Wild is kind of the reverse of that, so it's a story of a domestic dog's journey towards wildness, I guess. Again, like Swiss Family Robinson, this book has not aged well. It's explicitly racist towards Native Americans or the First Peoples. So one thing that London does really well in this book, up to one point where he completely ruins it, is that he doesn't anthropomorphize the dog at all. So everything is told from the dog's perspective, but he always qualifies every kind of feeling and thought that the dog has with the fact that he is trying to put this into language which is comprehensible to humans. The dog himself merely kind of feels these things, knows these things, instinctively is these things. And he does this really well in terms of hunting, prey, growing up as a cub, learning new behaviors. You get the interesting idea of what people want dogs to understand versus how that knowledge works its way into a dog's brain, and the kind of almost difference between the philosophies of humankind and of dogs, which is quite interesting. He does this really well up until the point where he says that the dog instinctively knew that a white man was superior to the Native Americans that he has up to this point been living with. I mean, Yeah, what? Alongside the racism, this book is also so violent. Like, unbelievably violent for a children's book. White Fang's upbringing is genuinely so traumatic to read about. Like, it's really abusive. He gets very similar, this happened again in Call of the Wild, has this sort of string of unkind, unloving, uncaring, or just totally messed up men as owners. And yes, it's always men. I think women appear in this novel for maybe about a full 2 sentences at a time, and in those 2 sentences they are definitely side characters. This is a very male novel. But yeah, White Fang's upbringing is totally abusive and traumatic, and therefore quite traumatic to read about. It makes this book one of those ones that treads the weird line of being famous for being a children's book, but not really being a children's book that you would actually want a child to read. In particular, there's one part of the dog's life where he ends up involved in dog fights, and they're described really brutally. You know, there's a lot of blood, cracking of bones and sinews and teeth and ripping of flesh to the bone. It's pretty violent and horrible. In spite of all of this, you can tell why it's a classic, because I think, like I mentioned, I've never read anything else like it. London does do something very different here, but I didn't enjoy it, and I think I'm definitely done with Jack London now. I had read Call of the Wild when I was a child. I read it with my mum, or she read it to me, and I remember that we were both appalled by it, but I also think I was probably only about 10 or so. I thought I'd over-remembered the violence and the grittiness of it, but it turns out I completely and utterly hadn't. That's just London's style. So that was Call of the Wild. And then the very last of my 7 books that I read last month was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I read this because it really fuels the imagination of the protagonist in All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, which is a beautiful book. I know probably if you're watching this video, quite likely that you've read it or at least heard of it. A modern book. The protagonist in that book is blind, and she reads 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in Braille, and it really kind of supports her and fuels her through a difficult time during the Second World War. This was another book that was weird, but like really, really weird. So the concept is that Pierre Aronnax, the protagonist who is writing the story, is a marine biologist and goes in search of this mysterious, massive monster, sea monster that's been sinking ships. And he goes with his extremely loyal, weirdly loyal servant Conseil, who spends the whole book basically showing that he would be completely and utterly happy to die for his master, believes his own life has no value except to serve Monsieur Aronnax. And he goes on this ship in search of this massive sea monster and ends up discovering that it's a massive metal submarine which swallows him like some kind of alien spaceship, and him and his servant and this guy called Ned Land, who's one of the most despicable and unpleasant characters I've ever met, get trapped inside this submarine with its mysterious captain, Captain Nemo, who has given up the real world due to some kind of tragedy, it seems, and spends his whole time travelling around under the sea in this submarine. They travel 20,000 leagues, not down, that's how I always imagined that the book would be, like about a journey to the bottom of the ocean, but rather just a distance of 20,000 leagues under the sea to all the different climates in the world, and basically have adventures in every single one. This book was almost an Alice in Wonderland-esque novel in terms of how bizarre it felt. It was sort of science fiction, I guess, but the experiences that the characters have under the sea it just feels like Jules Verne has let his imagination run wild, and it's kind of interesting to read. Again, like all of these books, I can totally see why they would have gripped the readers who read them at the time that they were published, but again, I don't feel that the style of it has really aged well to make it something gripping and fascinating now. The sort of travel cycle of the story gets a bit old, and for me the main interest of the plot was trying to work out what was going on with Captain Nemo, or just in general like a bit more character development. I felt like the characters were all quite 2D. Captain Nemo was intriguing, but I would have liked the intrigue there to have been more than it was, and for there to have been more exploration of that than there was. This book contained your classic colonial attitude, which has been very clear in all of the older children's literature books that I have read recently. It makes me realise how different the experience is of reading children's literature as an adult with more of an awareness of history versus reading it as a child. I do actually want to go through and just kind of read the spark notes of it, because I think there's stuff to unpack and explore in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. There's some interesting concepts, but I did listen to it in the background while I was working, and so I didn't really dig deep into those concepts as much as I would have liked to have done. Again, like all three of the books that I read, they were so heavily male. I don't think there was even one female character in this whole book, so that was a bit annoying. Again, didn't massively love it, but glad that I've read it so that I have an awareness of it. That wraps up at last all of the books that I read in February. Do let me know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, particularly the kind of older children's literature stuff that I've been reading. I think I would be really fascinated to hear other people's opinions on those books. Do you think that they still have an important place in modern society? Do you think that we should kind of let these stories die a death? Like, I saw that there's actually been a really recent adaptation of Call of the Wild, which just blows my mind. So yeah, I would be very interested to hear your opinions on it, or even just any nice books that you've read recently, because I know my February reading was a bit mixed. A couple of things I really liked. No actual full 5-star reads. I checked back, I gave the first 2 Hetty Feathers 4.5 stars, but I also read quite a lot of meh books that I'm kind of glad I've read, but which didn't exactly fill me with joy and enthusiasm for reading. So yeah, let me know your thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video very, very much.